The 1930s were a decade of great struggle and strife for the United States. The economy had collapsed, terrible drought and storms of dust ravaged America's farmlands, and politics, culture, and economics were undergoing radical changes in an already turbulent world. The Great Depression had begun in the United States, and because of a delicate economic cycle between the US and the European powers, the effects of the 1929 market crash radiated out to the rest of the world. Though that being said, most states endured a far briefer and milder economic downturn than the US, who stumbled through stagnation until the country's entry into the Second Great War finally reinvigorated its industries. It was during this period that the country placed its full faith in the leadership of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, electing him 4 consecutive times until ultimately he died in office only a few months into his 4th term. FDR campaigned on a promise of change and pragmatism. He did not have a perfectly defined plan in mind to solve the woes of the Depression, but was willing to try every option available until something finally worked, drawing inspiration from both the nascent progressive policies of his predecessor Herbert Hoover, as well as from various new ideologies overseas, the result of this being the First New Deal. As you might imagine, this rapid experimentation did not produce a cure for the Depression, but various treatments which alleviated the poor conditions of the time to varying degrees, ultimately failing to end it, and some even arguing that it was this experimental strategy that extended the duration of the Depression in the US while the countries of Europe rebounded. It did not help that nature had also dealt the United States a foul hand around this same time.
In the early 1930s, the Great Plains of the United States experienced a long and severe drought because of topsoil depletion and destruction caused by intensive farming activities from increased demand during the First Great War and the Roaring Twenties. These once fertile lands were reduced to dust. That dust was picked up by the high winds of the Plains region and turned into massive dust storms that absolutely devastated the region for years. Stretching from Texas in the south to the Dakotas in the north, Iowa in the east, and Wyoming in the west, the breadbasket of America was out of commission for nearly an entire decade, bringing the country from a state of overabundance just a few years prior to massive shortages. Factories and shops supplying farmers shuttered as they barely had enough money to feed themselves, let alone improve their equipment. Millions were displaced by the Dust Bowl, and many migrated to cities in search of better opportunity, putting an even greater strain on public services of those cities and making competition for jobs all the more difficult. If learning more about the daily life of the agriculture industry is something you're interested in, then come over to my channel, A Lion Eye Farmer, where I, an actual dairy farmer, show you what the life is actually like on our farm with weekly posts showing the daily life of an actual farmer.
All of these circumstances came together in a decade that stalled American development across every sector and forced the US to change course and return to foreign intervention in a desperate attempt to escape this economic chasm. But what if all that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the Great Depression and the entire hardship of the 30s as we knew it never happened? For the sake of not radically altering the histories of essentially all of Europe just from the get-go, we're going to propose a scenario in which a stock market crash still occurs and still radiates out to the rest of the world, but unlike in our timeline, the US is able to end this economic recession before it becomes a depression. We'll also be supposing that the Dust Bowl never occurs either, just for the sake of keeping the country from immediately sliding right back into an economic downturn, thus defeating the purpose of this scenario. Essentially, the 1930s, rather than derailing the US, remained a time of continued growth and stability for the country. On account of hindsight, we now know that there were a number of things that Hoover could have done earlier to prevent the crisis from escalating and potentially stop it in its tracks. Hoover was hesitant to resort to extreme measures of government intervention as he wanted to avoid the same expansion of government power that occurred under the earlier progressive administrations of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But he also wanted to avoid the utterly hands-off approach of the conservative Harding and Coolidge administrations, which he felt simply didn't do enough. Hoover had a synergistic vision of labor and business working side by side with government acting as a neutral mediator that ensured fair play. That vision, however, restrained Hoover from approaching the crisis with extreme effectiveness of one kind or another. It didn't help that Hoover went into the crisis overly optimistic. He saw that America had faced economic downturns before and assumed that this one could be resolved without an extreme approach. Of course that wouldn't be the case, and by the time he resorted to using significant federal power, the Depression was spiraling out of control and was only made worse by an uncertainty of private and public enterprises' role in the whole situation. The government was interfering with private businesses' ability to resolve the problems of the Depression, and vice versa, business was interfering with the federal government's ability to do the same. Something which would continue well into FDR's administration despite his more firmly federal policies, but this time, things are different. Hoover's advisors and research commissions inform him that the market crash will almost certainly devolve into a depression unless emergency federal powers are temporarily assumed to stabilize the issue. Having been repeatedly warned of such a catastrophe since his service in the Coolidge administration, Hoover hesitantly complies and establishes a bank holiday to prevent bank runs and evaluate funds currently available. Bank deposits are ensured to encourage the public to leave their money in the banking system despite the financial scare. Government investment in public works projects would be increased to prevent job shortages and meet public needs. Surplus goods would be bought up by the government to keep prices stable. Essentially anything that could be done would be done, and somehow the country is able to emerge from the recession by 1931. Hoover's reputation would be dramatically improved, no longer facing blame for mishandling the crash, but still facing some criticism for the crash occurring in the first place and for the extreme means by which he resolved it. Though that being said, his popularity would remain far higher than it would have had the Depression continued. Further, without the conditions of the Depression, public relations disasters like the Bonus Army incident are unlikely to occur as well, at the very least not on the same scale that they had in our world. Hoover would be able to spend the year leading up to the election of 1932 improving national policy as he originally intended, and casting the United States as the pillar of success in the world while many other European countries still struggled economically, bolstering his popularity in the process. Without the Depression, the support behind Hoover's opponent in the election of '32, FDR, would be impacted as well, as Roosevelt had really built his reputation for this campaign off of how he responded to the Depression in his home state. All of this taken into consideration, and given the absolute landslide FDR had won with in our world, the election would still come close along the popular vote, but ultimately favor Hoover in the electoral vote. Now, a continuation of the Hoover administration would likely cement a continuation of Republican domination of the country, as they had been the leading party since the end of the Civil War, with only Johnson, Cleveland, and Wilson interrupting this several decade-long trend. Though that being said, a political realignment would also be occurring around the same time, potentially breaking Republican rule come the following election. As we've already said, Hoover succeeded 2 conservative administrations which succeeded 3 progressive administrations, and this was the schism most evident not only within the Republican Party but across both parties. The conservatives of the day were generally laissez-faire when it came to economics, though favored protectionism and high tariffs and largely sought non-intervention in politics outside the continent, whereas progressives were generally pro-labor and favored involvement in competition with the other great powers of the world. There were additional minor differences in ideology across both parties, but largely this was the theme. Hoover was an evidently middle ground figure, unlike the definitively conservative Coolidge or the progressive Roosevelt. Much like his desire to promote cooperation between labor and business, he sought to hybridize conservative and progressive policy to ultimately promote the interests of all Americans, though in our timeline that was overshadowed by the radical measures FDR employed, thus making Hoover appear as nothing more than a laissez-faire conservative by comparison. As president, Hoover would continue to steer the country in a largely non-interventionist direction, further improving relations with Latin America in what would ultimately amount to an early emergence of good neighbor policy. Hoover would raise taxes on the wealthy as he had during his first term, and in turn reduce tariffs through a number of multilateral trade agreements, which largely benefited the US economy as a whole, while also providing more affordable American-made goods for nations abroad still suffering from the effects of the Depression. The exception to this rule would be a tariff on agricultural products as part of Hoover's effort to help farmers struggling to find adequate prices for their crops, something which would additionally help him secure support from the Midwest and the South. Business regulations would have already been dialed back during the Coolidge administration, but under Hoover would be met with complementary labor protections and policies to promote synchronicity between unions and businesses, possibly leading to the establishment of a National Recovery Administration-esque organization. The election of 1936 would take the country at a time of rising prosperity attributed to the success of Hoover and the Republicans, who would generally come to form a more socially conservative but economically progressive coalition in an attempt to further draw support from the solidly conservative Democrats South. These votes weren't necessary for success, but rather would help ensure the Democrats stood no chance of winning by depriving them of support from their most reliable states. Given the likely frontrunners for the Democrat Party would either be the extremely progressive FDR or the Catholic Al Smith, the Republicans could be expected to win this subsequent election as well unless they field a poor candidate or the Democrats raise up a new candidate who can play to the socially conservative taste of the South, the business interests of the North, and the progressive interests of the West. Now, there's also a wholly unique set of changes that would occur as a consequence of the Dust Bowl never happening.
The Dust Bowl happened due to a combination of factors: overworking of the soil by tilling too deep and disrupting the topsoil, and the ensuing loss of organic matter. Because of these reckless and aggressive farming methods used at the time, the soil balance was upset when the drought came. The farmland quite literally turned to dust. While destruction of the soils couldn't be fully stopped with the technology of the time, cover crops could have been used to buy time until such things were invented. Cover crops are essentially a sacrificial crop that us farmers plant knowing it will not yield anything, but is purely to build soil by building layers of organic matter and allowing nutrients to be more usable for the next crop planted. All of this could have been avoided through the use of better farming practices after the Great War. With the wealth and euphoria of the 20s coming in, farmers might have decided to reinvest into their land and equipment rather than spending it on modern consumer goods and vices as they did and still often do, allowing them to rebuild the depleted topsoil by increasing the organic matter and by converting from conventional tillage by plowing, disking, and cultivating to modern vertical tillage or no-till. With more people staying in the fields, it would boost production on farms and regional factories and leave more open jobs for city workers if there ever came an economic slump. If the Dust Bowl never happened, many farmers would feel almost bulletproof. After surviving a year of drought with only minor losses, reinvestment would be the theme of agriculture most likely for generations to come. America would become a beacon of prosperity for many of the European masses, who themselves would be facing shortages, shutdowns, and even worse in the East with famines like the Holodomor. A large number of people skilled in agriculture, animal husbandry, and forestry would, over the course of the 1930s, relocate to the American Northeast and Midwest. European nations would see a brain drain of their most skilled and ambitious inventors in the fields of agriculture, British and German industrialists leaving for more promising markets, and Ukrainian peasants fleeing the mismanagement of the Soviet system. This would not only add a pillar to the American industry, but skilled field workers to aid in the production of crop management and livestock. The British inventors behind Massey Ferguson and JCB would set up in the Northeast, with the innovative German founders of Fendt and Class moving to northern Illinois to be closer to their cultural and industrial cousins of John Deere, International, Cat, and Alice Chalmers. The Ukrainian field workers would be spread thinly over the Midwest, finding work wherever they could. With America's agricultural field being bolstered even further by an influx of skilled migrants, this would allow companies such as International, Deere, Caterpillar, and Alice Chalmers to become the tech giants of their time, turning the upper Midwest into arguably the world's most important industrial center, surpassing northern England and the Rhineland, only being rivaled by the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic.
A timeline in which the United States never experiences the struggles of the Great Depression nor the crippling effects of the Dust Bowl is one in which the country is utterly unmatched in economic might thanks to both its industrial and agricultural production, with several individual states rivaling countries like Britain, France, and Germany. That's not even mentioning the beneficial effects Hoover's policies would have on the country without the Great Depression to hinder them. Businesses would have freer rein to conduct themselves as necessary to produce quality products for optimal profit, while laborers would be ensured safe conditions, reliable work, and steady wage through greater ability to negotiate. The highest incomes in the country would be taxed, and that money would be put toward reducing or eliminating the federal deficit, never forcing the country to assume the radical debt strategy that began under FDR, and thus preserve the buying power of the American dollar. Given the country's seeming return to non-intervention, it's unlikely the United States would involve itself in the Second Great War, and given how merely providing support to Britain in the First Great War dragged the US into that conflict, it's questionable if that would even occur anywhere near the scale of Lend-Lease in this timeline. The absence of any US support would be crippling to Britain and the USSR in their fight against Germany, though fortunately for them, the agricultural and general brain drain that would have occurred in Europe as a consequence of American prosperity would significantly diminish Germany's ability to support so large an army across so large an area without a domestic manufacture of farming machinery or other important industries. This could mean that Germany settles for a stalemate with Britain, withdraws from France, keeps Poland but never invades the USSR. This could mean that Germany still attempts to fight a two-front war but is ultimately defeated upon the collapse of its supply lines, or Germany is able to starve the British out earlier on given that the British would also be negatively affected, and Germany later directs its undivided attention to an invasion of the USSR, who would now have no vital aid from the US. What's for certain is that without the United States, World War II would have taken on a drastically different character. The war in the Pacific might still occur, but given that a reduction in overall supplies is a key differing factor in this alternate version of the European conflict, it's safe to assume it will end earlier and thus not overlap with a potential but unlikely Amero-Japanese war.
Hi, my name is Alex. I run the Illini Farmer YouTube channel. I'm a 5th generation dairyman, and I post videos about my life on a rural Midwestern dairy farm. So if you enjoyed the agricultural section of this video and you want to learn more, come on over to my channel. There should be a link to it in the description and in the pinned comment.
The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.